So today we will learn about functions in Python. So basically a function is a block of organized reusable code that is used to perform a single related action. So for example, if you want to perform the same action time and again and you want to use that action in your business logic multiple times in a program, so what you do is that you don't write code again and again. You just create a function and put all your code inside a function and then just call that function to perform that duty. So there are several types of functions in Python. So you don't need to define a type for that, but it all depends upon how you pass the arguments, how you return the value from a function. So we will start with a void function. Let's create a function. So in order to create a function, you need to use the keyword def. It's actually used for define. So it's going to define the key, define the function. So I'm going to say my name, and every time when you are calling a function or defining a function, you always need to give the parenthesis to that. So let's now you are inside the function. You can write whatever you want. I'm going to print that this is a void function, and in order to end the function, it's very important that you write return. So you can either return something, like you want to return a string, an integer, float, list, tuple. You can return any data type, but if you don't want to return anything, then you just type return. In order to call the function, you have to get out of the bounds of the function and just write the function name, give it the parenthesis. Now let's test it, and if we test it, you can see that it has given us a result that this is a void function. Now we are going to create a function with a parameter or with the argument. So I will say def arg function. I'm going to pass an argument in this function, and I'm going to print this argument that this is an arg, and I'll uh, concatenate that argument, which is string, and I'm going to return. Now let's call this function. Now if you have defined a function with a parameter, and if you don't provide a parameter here, so it's going to throw an error. Let's see. So it will tell you that missing one required position argument str. Where you are calling the function, you are supposed to provide the parameter to that. Now let's say this string was my name is Aman, and now then if I print this, it's going to say that this is an argument, and this is the value of the argument that we given here. So what actually happens is that when you write the function name, when you call a function, and when you are inside the parenthesis, it will look for the parameter that is passed. So we are actually passing the value to the parameter in the function. So this function here str will have this value, and here str is printing the same value. So now let's move forward. So after the argument function, we are going to create a reference function. So in Python, the arguments that are passed by reference. There are two types: passing a parameter with reference or with value. So in Python, it's always with reference. So let's create a function. I would say this is my ref func. I'm going to pass a parameter. This time I'm using the list. I will use multiple data types so that you can have a better understanding of this. So here in my list, I'm going to append some values like x, y, and z. So when I'll call this function, I'll give it a list, and in list I'm going to append the value to this list. Now I'll say print my list. Now here I will again create my list. Now I'm going to give it a different name so that you can have better understanding of what is the parameter passed by reference. So let's call the function. I'll call the function ref function. I am giving the parameter my list here. Let's print this. So if you print this, you can see that it has given me 1 2 3 and then it has appended xyz to this. Now when we have passed this list here, this list is passed by the reference. By reference means that this instance is actually passed here. So we are actually giving the reference of this variable to this function, and here this parameter has the same reference of this list. So when it appends values, it's actually appending values to this list. Now let's try to print my list here. So here my list here is not being appended anything, but because this reference is passed in this function, so this function has actually appended these values to this list. So now let's test this. Now you can see that both lists have changed their values. But now we will use local variables in function. So I'm going to define a function, say local func, and I'm going to give this again my list. And here, so when inside a function, if you are initializing any data type or any variable, you are actually initializing that variable inside the function, which is not going to affect the value of that variable or the instance of the variable outside the function, because this variable here is passed by reference. But since we are making a new initialization, so the identity of variable changes. So if I say my list equals to 1 2 and 3, and if I print this my list here and I return, let's call this local func. But before calling this, I will create my list here as well, and this time it's going to be 5 6 7. So this function requires the list. This is my list. Let's print this. This is giving us 1 2 3 instead of 5 6 7, because this has been initialized here, so this has become the new instance, and so its reference has been changed. So if I print this before calling the function, it must give me the values 5 6 7. So here you can see that it has given me the values of 5 6 7, but when we are calling this function and providing this my list, this is initializing it with a new instance of a list, and these values are assigned to this list. Thus it is printing that list. Now we'll move forward with the default value of the arguments. As we have tested that if we are not providing argument to the function, it's throwing an error. But how to avoid that? So in order to avoid that, you need to define a function. So let's say I'm defining a def func. I'm giving it a name, so here's argument 1, or say argument is a name and then age. So you can also give it value here. So I've given it the value 35, so age will always be defined with or assigned 35. Even if you are not passing the parameter, the age would be 35. But if you are passing the parameter, then that parameter value would be the value of the age. So now let's say print. I'll print name and I'll print age and I'll return. Now when I call this function def_func, it's going to ask me two parameters. So here you can see that it's telling me that age is an integer of value of 35. So I'm saying that Aman, and my age is not 35, I'm giving it a 28. So let's run this. So you can see that this 35 is not used because we have already provided the parameter here. So now the age is being initialized by 28. Now let's see what happens when we don't give the second argument. So if we print this, you can see that John is 35 years old, because when we did not give the value to the second parameter, when the function was called, it saw that the age is not assigned or given any parameter while calling the function. It gave it the default value, that is 35. You can avoid the error that happens when you don't pass an argument. Now this is limited. By limited I mean that this these parameters would always be in a length that you are going to give them. By length I mean the number of parameters in the function. So if I want to give infinite number of the parameters to a function, then I'm going to create a tuple argument. I'm going to give a tuple argument to the function. So let's say define asterisk function. I'm going to give it the argument 1, and then for an anonymous argument, or for an argument that is unlimited, we need to give an argument that would be a tuple. It's not because I have written tuple here, but by this asterisk argument is always a tuple. This is just a name, you can name it what you want. So let's print, I would say arg1, and then let's print argtuple, and then return. And then when I call this function, I'm going to say Aman. So initially we are not going to give it any value. So this argtuple is empty here. You can see that there is no value in the tuple. This parenthesis is telling it that this is a tuple. So if I give it a value like this, it's going to take the value 1. So I can assign as many values as I want, like this. And if you go ahead, you can see that it is giving all the values in the tuple. You can also run a loop here. So for example, say for well in argtuple print well. So this time if you run this, you can see that it has run the loop of all the values. Now there's also a lambda function, or an anonymous function. So it's a one-liner function. There's no parenthesis, there's no defined keyword. It's just a one-liner function. It's used to perform tiny task or tiny portion of the code. So let's say I want to sum two values. You are going to use the keyword lambda, and then you are going to give the arguments. I given it the two arguments. So now after the two arguments, after the column it's going to return the value. So what value is going to return? I'm going to sum both these. When I call this function here sum, you can see that it's asking me for two parameters. So I'm giving it 10 and 20, so its sum must be 30. You can see that it has given us the 30 here. We also call this an anonymous function. So now we are going to create a function where we can see that how local variables work and what is the difference between local and global variables. So if you are defining a function, and if you are defining a data type inside a function, that data type becomes the local data type of that function. That cannot or that does not change the value or does not change the values outside the bounds of the function. So let's say I'm creating a glovar function. I'm going to say argument 1 and argument 2. So we have created the function here, and I'm going to say total equals to 0. And now since I have initialized total with arg1 plus arg2, and I'm going to print this, I'm going to say this is inside the function. I'm going to typecast this total, and let's call this function global var. It's asking me for the values. I'm going to do the 2 and 3. It should return me that inside the function it's 5. Now let's print total. Now if I print total, the expected output is 0, because here this total becomes the local variable, and this has changed the value, and this can only be used inside the variable. This total cannot be used outside the variable. So here if I print the total, it's going to print 0. Now there is a problem. I mean, there can be a problem that how to change the value of this total. So if you want to change the value of this total, you need to use the global. So remove this, we don't need this. I'm going to say global total. So now this total variable now becomes the global variable, means that this can be used outside the purview of this function. So this total here, global, this I'm calling this total outside the function, even though this total is not defined anywhere, but since it has been given the keyword total global, so this total becomes a global variable, right? And whenever the variable is global, you can use it outside the function. So let's test it. Here you can see that inside the function it's 5, this one, and outside the function it's also 5. So this was all about the functions, how to create the functions and how to call the functions. So functions are really important in the reusability of the code, and it saves a lot of your time. So whenever you think that you need to write code again and again, you just simply convert your code into a function and call that function. I can also give you an example for that. Let's define a function, say sumfunc. So sumfunc is going to val1 comma val2. So this function is created to sum the values. So I would say total equals to val1 plus val2, and then return total. Now here we are also learning the return value, because here we are not returning anything, but here we are returning the total. So now when you call this function has a return keyword with a value. So this function is going to return this total, and whatever the data type of this total is, that would be the return data type of the function. So say I'm going to say my total equals to sumfunc, and I'm going to add 10 and 20, and if I print my total, it's going to print 30. You can see that this 10 plus 20 equals to 30. I haven't added any print statement inside the function. I'm only returning the value, and this total value is being called here. Now let's say you want to do more addition. I want to add 100 to 200. I want to add 2 to 1. You can perform all these actions. So now with a single function you perform the addition. So likewise you can perform any action you want. So, and this was all about functions in Python, and I hope you enjoyed the video.